Just another quick welcome to everyone. We're going to wait another 2 minutes before, well, 1 minute actually, before we get started. We have a really packed agenda, so we're really excited to see all of you on this call today. I'll wait, one more minute, and then we'll get started. And we will send out recording of this to attendees as well afterwards. Great. I think we can get started. So welcome everyone. This is our webinar where we're going over all the latest updates from the brand new FATF guidelines for the crypto industry that were released last week. There's a lot to cover. There's I can't remember how many pages are in this guidelines, but there's a lot of things to cover in here and a lot of things that are very important for the crypto industry to understand and figure out how it applies to your business going forward. So I am Pelle Brandgaard. I'm the CEO of Notabene. I'm joined today by Alice Naufal, who is my co-founder and COO also at Notabene, and Catarina Veloso, who is our new legal engineer. If you haven't met Catarina yet, she does these also amazing webinars for compliance people on a monthly basis. So please do sign up for those as well. Very briefly, Notabene is, if you don't know us already, we are a company that helps you implement the travel rule, and specifically for crypto businesses, for virtual assets. So we help you comply with a fair amount of the regulation in here. There's a lot of the regulations that we don't have anything to do with directly, but you always have to look at these things from a holistic point of view. At the end, we'll be doing a Q&A. And if you look at the bottom of your Zoom, there's a Q&A section there. And please go in and you can please ask any questions you have. You can start do the whole thing. But since there's so much to cover, we're going to try and just do the Q&A section towards the end. Great. So our agenda today is we're going to cover an introduction to what these guidelines are and what the goal is about them and the history of it. We're going to cover a lot about the new risk assessment of virtual assets and VASPs, as well as the definitions of virtual assets and VASPs that are covered in there, particularly some of the new changes that are in there. We're then going to cover the travel rule and then go over a final note around overall how to look at this, and finally a Q&A section. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Alice.
Great. Thank you so much, Pelle, and thank you everyone for joining us. So we're going to get started with an introduction as to essentially what are the FATF guidance here. So we'll start off with a scope of the FATF guidance on virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, the evolution of the FATF guidance, and then essentially what has, in a quick summary, been updated in terms of the outline of the guidance this time around. So to get started with the scope, actually, Pelle, can you please go ahead? Thank you so much. I forgot, I don't own the screen. So in terms of what is the scope of the FATF guidance on virtual assets and virtual asset service providers? Essentially, the FATF recommendations are the basis on which all the countries around the world have a shared objective in which they can tackle money laundering, terrorist financing, and the financing of proliferation. And then this guidance takes the existing FATF recommendations and sees how they can be applied to virtual assets, virtual asset activities, as well as virtual asset service providers, essentially in order to help countries be able to better understand how they should implement the FATF standards effectively to the crypto industry. So one of the main things that they do is start off with defining virtual assets, virtual asset activities, and so forth. And then when basically applying the recommendations to the space, see how that can either be immediately implemented or slightly modified to make sure that it still applies with the new technology. Great. So in terms of basically the history of the FATF guidance on virtual assets, the first guidance was released in 2019, where FATF essentially for the first time extended the FATF recommendations to the crypto industry. They started off by defining virtual assets, virtual asset service providers, starting to highlight some of the risks or potential risks involved there, and extended the travel rule to the space, as well as introduced a licensing and regulatory expectations around virtual asset service providers. And then over the last couple of years, FATF has done a couple of different 12-month reviews where essentially they would assess how far both the public sector as well as the private sector has evolved in terms of implementing the FATF recommendations for virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. Earlier this year, essentially, the FATF released a public consultation where they had a draft of the updated guidance. And then as an industry, we all provided feedback, both in terms of written feedback as well as in certain closed door sessions with FATF, where we provided some input into those draft guidance. And of course, then these are the ones that you see today that were released last Thursday post the FATF plenary. So this is essentially the outline of the updated guidance, and it's pretty similar to what was before. So they tend to keep kind of a very similar structure, but then they just tend to expand or clarify specific sections. So to go over a bit over this, so part one is usually just an introduction around kind of the scope of FATF and how it applies to virtual assets and so forth. In terms of part two, where they go over the scope of the standards themselves, they do start defining essentially what are virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. And in the 2019 guidance, the definition was pretty clear, but of course, as technology has evolved, there are certain questions that come up always, for example, with more decentralized technology and so forth. And so in today's newer guidelines, essentially, FATF has kept the same definition, but it's become more expansive. So they provide more clarifications on what does it mean for, let's say, stable coins or NFTs, DeFi, and so forth. The next part essentially is where they take those FATF standards and then clarify how countries and other competent authorities should implement those. And of course, now that there's almost like 2 years of different countries starting to look at this and so forth, FATF here has been able to highlight some challenges, some additional recommendations and guidance on how countries can introduce a risk-based approach for licensing and registration regimes, as well as assessing risk levels. Part four is essentially taking those same FATF standards and now applying to VASPs and other obliged entities who engage or provide covered VA activities. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially looking at how virtual asset service providers would implement those FATF standards. In this, in the 2021 guidance, essentially what they've done is expand the travel rule requirements and have included some more VASP due diligence requirements as well. And then part five is about certain country examples where different countries have introduced a risk-based approach to starting to regulate the virtual asset and virtual asset service provider space. And so FATF in this case, again, has had 2 years in which they can share some case studies around what different jurisdictions such as Italy, Japan, and others have taken to introduce risk-based approach locally. And then finally, there's some principles around information sharing and cooperation amongst VASP supervisors. And I think this is a thread as well that kind of goes throughout the FATF guidelines, where FATF very much recommends a lot of collaboration among different groups within governments and within the regulatory bodies, but also between public and private bodies. And in this section, they go more into how information can be shared among the different VASP supervisors globally. Great, thank you, Pelle. So the next section is around the risk assessment of virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. We'll first go over what is, or essentially how does FATF look at the risk-based approach for the space, and then how that applies to stable coins, peer-to-peer transactions, as well as more broadly virtual assets and virtual asset service providers in terms of risk factors. So to get started with, in this case, around how does FATF look at a risk-based approach? So the first thing is that FATF takes the approach that it should be the assessment of risks that guides regulation rather than the underlying technology, business model, or terminology. So with that, they introduced two concepts. The first one is technology neutrality, and the other one is the level playing field. And in terms of technology neutrality, essentially what they say is, it doesn't matter what the underlying technology is here, but if there are two technologies but provide same services, same risk level, they should be treated the same. And then in terms of the level playing field, they say if there are VASPs who provide same services and have the same risk level, then they should be treated the same with as each other. There shouldn't be any sort of like discrimination for one against the other, but that also extends to financial institutions. So if there is a virtual asset service provider that provides same services and similar risk level to another FI, that it should be treated similarly. And so essentially taking it from there, FATF goes ahead and says that now jurisdictions can apply a risk-based approach to mitigate or prevent these risks from being from taking hold locally. And by the way, I just wanted to mention here for our formatting, as you could see, there's numbers on the right-hand side. So these are the sections of the FATF guidelines. You can go ahead and find those specific sections that we're highlighting here. And so in this particular section, then FATF goes ahead and says, there are certain virtual asset activities that could be higher risk, and local regulators need to continue to have like a forward-looking approach and ongoing monitoring to assess what are the risks that these impose to them and whether they're able to introduce measures that mitigate those risk factors. So they leave it up to the country to decide on that, but they do highlight at a broad level peer-to-peer transactions. They do highlight centralization versus decentralization, as well as stable coins. And then one of the interesting aspects here that they do also bring out, which I think is a super good thing for the space right now, is that they do mention that it's not only that, regulators need to treat VASPs with a level playing field, but so should financial institutions. And financial institutions should apply a risk-based approach when working with VASPs and not essentially terminate or exclude the VASP sector holistically from having a business relationship with them. So in terms of if you think about banking partners and so forth. And so the main takeaway here is that FATF really discourages a blanket approach when regulating virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. But however, going forward, given that they do highlight certain virtual asset activities could pose higher risk, we do expect that regulators are going to pay a lot of close attention to those activities and may propose certain mitigating actions locally, and these may end up differing from country to country in the meantime, since FATF doesn't have an overall guideline around that. Pelle, can you please go to the next slide? Great, thank you so much. So then on stablecoins, one of the main things here is that essentially FATF believes that since stablecoins have almost like a higher chance in the short run to be mass adopted, they're afraid that this could end up meaning that they become higher risk. And so they highlight certain aspects around that, and I believe Pelle as well will go a bit more into this later on. But one of the main things they do say is it has a potential for mass adoption, and that's mainly because because of the lack of volatility, and also because of like the aspect of making it easy for like peer-to-peer payments and so forth. And so where they do kind of highlight if there is a stable coin that has that potential for mass adoption, but there are no intermediaries or VASPs or obliged entities involved in it, then that can increase the ML and TF risks on that. The other aspect here is also how centralized the governing bodies are. So if, especially FATF mentions in the early days, if there are certain centralized governing bodies, then they will definitely be covered by the FATF rules. Another thing here then is that as FATF basically kind of provides some ways in which local regulators can assess the ML and TF risks. On the other side, they also mentioned that this should be done on an ongoing and forward-looking manner. What this means is, the first part is that essentially they say that regulators need to undertake the ML and TF risk assessment prior to the launch or use of a stablecoin, but so do the companies themselves or the organizations who are launching the stablecoin. They have to build in kind of those compliance or those risk mitigating factors into the product itself. And then the other part of that is that once the product is launched, both the company has the obligation or whoever basically the governing body is, to make sure that the risks continue to be mitigated on an ongoing basis. And then the regulator as well is supposed to continue to kind of look at that. And our takeaway here is that there will be a close scrutiny on stablecoins, especially those that have this mass adoption quality involved. However, we do think on the other side, this is going to encourage more VASPs to start building compliance into new stablecoin products. What we didn't cover here is that actually, I think in the last maybe 24 to 48 hours, several jurisdictions have already launched some additional guidance on stablecoins. So I think there's going to be a lot of activity there over the next few weeks. So you'll be hearing more from us on that. Great. And then in terms of peer-to-peer transactions, so one of the things that FATF did this time is actually define that, which was really helpful. And they do define peer-to-peer transactions as not involving any intermediary on both sides of the transaction. So essentially between two unhosted wallets. And they do mention that there are certain peer-to-peer platforms. However, those peer-to-peer platforms tend to usually be a VASP. Of course, there's some question here around how all of them operate, but they do make that distinction there, mainly because there was some confusion earlier this year when the draft guidance came out around that. But one of the things here is that FATF has been looking at, as you all know, at regulating obliged entities of virtual asset service providers, and they've kept close scrutiny of peer-to-peer transactions to assess, do these pose higher risk? And so earlier this year, when they released their one-year assessment, they found out that there was some mixed evidence or not enough evidence to show whether peer-to-peer transactions posed a higher or not a higher risk at all. So at this point, they've refrained from actually adding anything very specific around that. However, they do start acknowledging certain aspects and provide a bit more guidance for local regulators. So what they do here is that the first thing they say is they do kind of point out that peer-to-peer transactions could be used to avoid AML CFT controls, even though they have not seen a lot of evidence of that. But what they fear there is with additional regulation on VASPs that users may end up going to peer-to-peer transactions. On the other side, they have acknowledged the visibility of public ledgers and of course all the tools like blockchain analytics and others, which help to provide a lot more visibility on those types of transactions. And so based on this, what they have recommended for local regulators is that, again, on an ongoing and forward-looking basis, and you see that kind of like sentence is a bit of a theme across this section, what they recommend is that jurisdictions continue to do that risk assessment. And here they provide three methodologies. The first one is an outreach to the private sector, where they can learn a lot more about how the technologies are being built and so forth. Training of personnel on their side, whether it's law enforcement or within the FIUs and others. And then encouraging the private sector to build new risk mitigation tools, including basically helping identify if a wallet is custodial or non-custodial, or certain almost like risk scoring and so forth. And then in terms of the mitigating factors that jurisdictions could take, here, of course, they're not enforcing anything, but they just provide some options. The first part is new record-keeping requirements for VASPs when transacting with non-custodial wallets. As we have seen, several jurisdictions have already been implementing this. They do point out one, which I've highlighted here, which I think is the first time this is set as a precedent, which is limiting transaction flow. Whether this is with addresses, which already there's been like a risk-based approach applied to that and are considered low risk, or even just between VASPs. And then other ones that other options that they've provided include placing additional kind of like AML requirements on VASP that allow transactions to unhosted wallets, as well as basically publishing more local guidance in terms of whether there are certain risks involved and so forth. The way we've been looking at this is almost there's like a mixed, some mixed takeaways here for us as an industry. The first part, I think that's really good, is that FATF does encourage public-private collaboration on new solutions and tools. On the other side, it does open the door for countries to take much stricter controls when dealing with unhosted wallets. Next one, please, Peller. Great, thank you. And this is the last section in this part, where essentially FATF has provided both, I guess, the industry, but also both regulators and the industry some guidance on how to, on what constitutes certain risk factors or how to properly assess the risk factor. And here they basically split that into virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. So when either a regulator is looking to assess the risk of a certain virtual asset, or a virtual asset service provider is looking to assess the risk of that, of a virtual asset that they may want to allow transactions with, they should look at market-based data, such as the amount and value of transactions, market cap, price volatility, and so forth. They also should look at the nature and scope of payment channels, connection to fiat-based transaction platforms. Basically, FATF believes that this kind of connection to fiat-based platforms lower the risk. Percent of transactions involved with illicit activities. Here they specifically point out breaking that down into VASP to VASP, VASP to unhosted, peer-to-peer. The availability of anonymization technologies, as well as general business information about the governing entity in this case, if that's applicable. And then in terms of elements relating to VASP, so when a regulator looks to assess the risk of a particular obliged entity, or when a VASP is looking to have a business relationship or transact as a counterparty to another VASP, they should essentially look at certain aspects which are highlighted here. And these include the nature of the AML and CFT program and measures in place to lower risk, the size and type of user base, how they implemented travel rule, and what mitigating factors they've done with the Sunrise issue, and whether there's certain sanctions risk associated with the jurisdiction that they're part of, as well as the types of virtual assets that they support. And here we believe this is just super helpful for, I guess, super helpful guidance in general. And we do believe that then jurisdictions are going to probably ask more carefully VASPs to show when they do add support, let's say, to a new virtual asset, or when they do show that they're interacting with virtual asset service providers in certain jurisdictions, to provide evidence along those lines on why they've allowed this interaction. Okay, I think this is it on my side, so I'll hand it over to Pelle.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alice. That was really helpful. I did want to just point out one question that was there from DS Lonapan. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, who asked, with reference to stablecoin regulation, does that mean most entities cannot use Tether, USD, etc.? And I think this is asking for some guidance around how to analyze that risk. And this is actually where you can go in and look and how to establish that risk. So it's not that most entities cannot interact with USDC or Tether. It's not saying that at all, but they're just what you have to go in and look at it and build this risk-based approach. So this is kind of a good high-level guide, but we do recommend looking at the actual recommendation as well, paragraph 42, to guide you through that. All right, so I will now cover definitions, and definitions, you know, when it comes to regulation and guidelines is always one of the more controversial and fun areas of this. But we'll try and take a look through the actual wording of the guidance. And the first part of it is regarding virtual assets themselves. So virtual assets is FATF's word for cryptocurrencies or tokens, etc. So from a high level, not much has changed there. So essentially a virtual asset is tradable, it's transferable, it can be used for payment or investment purposes. That's actually, I think, a fairly useful clarification in there. One thing that they are directly excluding now is assets that are already considered a financial asset in here. So they're not covered elsewhere. So for example, if you may have a European e-money provider, and the e-money provider may fit some of these, their e-money offering may fit some of these definitions, but it's already covered elsewhere as part of FATF and local regulation. So it's excluded as a virtual asset in this particular case. But one new thing that they are spelling out a lot throughout the guidance is that their definition are intended to be read very broadly and expansively. And they're trying to keep things, again, extremely broad and not go into detailed specifics of technology. So this is something that you'll see throughout these guidelines. And I think it's something that we'll see a lot in national regulations as well. So NFTs, are NFTs covered? So from the first reading, it looks great. So, you know, they say that if they are used as collectibles rather than for payments and investment instruments, then they're just crypto collectibles and not virtual assets. However, it gets a little bit more complex, right? Because people are using NFTs as investment instruments. They're probably not using them not that much as payment instruments, but we definitely see a lot of people getting into the NFT space and using them for investment instruments. So there's a definite gray area here. And as an industry, we need to figure out what that means. And I think it's something where it's always best for the industry to come up with their interpretation and then reach out with local regulators, national regulators to help come up with this guidance to figure out the right approach forward here, because it's definitely a gray area. So keep an eye on that going forward. And if you are actively working with NFTs, it's definitely something that we recommend that you think about and you work with legal counsel to figure out how to handle that. And also, of course, always have conversations with your national regulators. Now, the definition of VASPs is pretty much the same as before, with the additional, term there about these have to be read broadly and expansively. But it is really, it's a really useful thing to actually look through some of the specific hints that they give in their guidance. So any natural legal person who as a business conducts one or more of the following operations on behalf of another natural or legal person. So within there, we actually really get a lot of hints about what they consider a VASP. And then there are some very specific functions that VASP do, and these haven't really changed a lot. So essentially, if you're exchanging between virtual assets and fiat currencies, if you're exchanging between multiple types of virtual assets, if you're helping transfer virtual assets, if you're helping safekeeping or custody of virtual assets, any kind of participation in a provision of financial services related to an issuer's offer or sale of virtual assets. So essentially a token issuance kind of service. Those are all essentially considered VASPs, and not much has really changed when it comes to that. But they are adding this that this is intended to be read broadly and expansively. And many areas in the guidelines do they also cover that this is something that has to be read also as being technology agnostic. And we'll see why they mention that coming soon when we get to the DeFi section. One area that there's still a lot of confusion about is multi-sig custodial API-like services. And I would include MPC's multi-sig kind of functionalities as being roughly equivalent according to their guidelines, but unfortunately, there's still a lot of confusion in here. So they say, we are, a lot of custodial API services see themselves as essentially internet or cloud services. So according to the first section, you're not covered. But then there are all of these other exceptions in here. Multi-signature processes are not inherently exempt. And so there's a lot of confusion in here. And I think this is something where the industry, if you're in this industry, you're providing these kinds of services, it's something where you should be very proactive with your national regulators, trying to get some clarification in here. We're happy to work with you as well on these areas, because we're also trying to figure out where these kinds of services fit as an intermediary in the travel rule flow as well. So I look at this as initially it looks like it's good news, but then all of a sudden you see there's a bunch of exceptions. So we don't really know. We don't have a clear answer here yet, unfortunately. But more work definitely needs to be done. And I think more work needs to be done working directly with regulators and clarifying some of these things. So when FATF released the first draft of these updated guidelines in March, there's a lot of controversy around all the expansive definitions of VASP covering a lot of different DeFi protocols. They've made things a lot clearer. It's still not 100% clear, but there's a lot more clarifications within there than there was in the March draft, for sure. But there are definitely some hints at things that they definitely consider you are VASP if you have control of a DeFi protocol. If you are a central party, you hold the admin key or collecting fees for a particular protocol, you are likely a VASP according to their definition. But they're also clear that the software program itself, the DeFi application or protocol itself, is not a VASP. It's individuals who are related to it that could be VASP. So it's someone who maintains control or strong influence on it that likely would come under their definition of a VASP. It's also very interesting that they call out marketing terms. As an industry, we're building all of these new things, so we will invent new terms for it all the time, and that's what we do as innovators in this space. But they are also pointing out that you shouldn't look at what people self-identify as in here. You should look at what people do, and not also what the technology is. So just because you're using smart contracts deployed on Ethereum does not mean you're not a VASP. You have to think through a lot of these kinds of things very, very, very closely and think about the roles of the different parties in the system. They get into a little bit more detail around this as well. And I think this is mostly good guidance. So when it comes to governance tokens, there's definitely been some worry about what happens to governance token holders. So individual token holders, they don't really have the responsibility according to this, as long as they don't exercise sufficient influence. You could imagine there might be similar rules in the future to controlled, like who has control within a company. Some of those rules might apply in the future. Again, no specific mention of that right now. And they are also open to the fact that there are DeFi protocols that actually are decentralized, where there isn't necessarily a party who's involved with it. And it's a good thing that they're calling out that may actually happen. And if you look at the way they've looked at decentralized protocols like Bitcoin or Ethereum in the past, they're definitely open to that. So they're not trying to ban DeFi, but if there are different parties involved with it, and who have some kind of control or governance over it, it's definitely a risk factor for you that you could be considered a VASP. So as always, it's really important for the DeFi community to be proactive in this and really look at solving this. We also think there's a role for traditional VASP in being part of solving these kind of things going forward. Now, Alice already covered stable coins and the risk parts for stable risk assessment of stable coins. And there are kind of two kinds of stable coins that they mentioned. One is the more centrally issued stable coin, such as a USDC or Tether, where there is a centralized issuer and developer and governance body. So in those cases, it's fairly clear that they consider them to be FIs or VASPs. But not all stable coins come under that definition. There are, for example, what people call algorithmic stable coins, where the stability mechanism happens through some kind of on-chain mechanism, and there's no central issuer that has the liability behind that stable coin. So in these cases, it's a little bit unclear, and I think regulators are still trying to figure out how to deal with it. So, but if you are someone who is rolling out a service like that, they are recommending that regulators reach out to developers of such algorithmic stablecoins before they are launched to come up with some kind of approach there. Now, what that actually means in practice is still to be seen. But developers of these algorithmic stablecoins might be covered under some expansive view of the VASP definition. But it's absolutely a gray area for sure. And I'd like to hand it over to Katarina, who will go over the travel rule.
Hey, everyone. Thank you, Pelle and Alice, for the insight so far. Before I start, I wanted to address Nigel's question. And the question is whether there's any available data that shows VASP compliance and adoption of the travel rule. So we are actually running a survey that we distributed across many jurisdictions, and that is targeted at VASPs, exactly to gather this data, because currently this data doesn't exist, and it would help a lot the industry to know where we stand, so that we can tackle the pain points more effectively. The survey is still on, so we can then share a link to it in case you want to participate. And we shared last week the first insights that we gathered from the data so far. But by the end of the month, we should be able to publish a report with all the insights and all the information that we gathered. Okay, so in my part, I'll talk about what the updated guidance says about the travel rule, as this is actually our main focus here at Notabene. And first, for context, for those of you who may not be as familiar with what this is all about, the travel rule is essentially a set of obligations that VASPs need to fulfill to manage money laundering and terrorism financing risks at the transaction level. We will start with the scope of application, and I'll try to be fast so that we can save some time for a QA at the end. But starting with the scope. So generally, the travel rule requirements are applicable whenever VASPs carry out a traditional wire transfer or a virtual asset transfer with another VASP. And this is the novelty of the guidance. This is one of the big novelties of the guidance issued last week, is that the travel rule requirements are also now applicable to transactions carried out between VASPs and non-obliged entities, such as unhosted wallets. But here it's also important to note that the scope of the travel rule requirements when applicable to transactions with non-obliged entities is specific, and it's not the full scope of requirements that is applicable. But we'll cover that later on in more detail. What this also tells us is that to be able to apply the right rules and to pick the right process for the transaction, the VASP will in the first place need to determine whether the transaction is with a VASP or with an unhosted wallet. Because since requirements are different, then this is the first pain point and the first challenge for VASPs to identify whether the wallet belongs to another VASP or to an unhosted wallet. Can we go next? Yeah. Okay. So still within the scope of application of the travel rule, I wanted to talk about the transaction threshold issue. So in the first guidance issued by the FATF in 2019, they allowed countries to establish a minimum transaction threshold of 1,000 USD or euros, below which virtual asset transfers would not need to be subject to travel rule requirements. But one of the big novelties of the updated guidance issued last week is that transactions below this threshold should now also be subject to a limited scope of requirements. And more specifically, what the FATF recommends is that regardless of the transaction amount, VASPs still collect the name and the wallet address of both the originator and the beneficiary of the transactions. And in case of suspicions of money laundering or or terrorism financing, that they verify this information as well. So now there's no escaping at least a limited scope of travel rule requirements. And actually in many jurisdictions, the implementation of the travel rule currently does not foresee any requirements applicable to transactions below certain thresholds. So in principle, this will be a change that will require adaptations from national regulators. Let's see how that evolves there. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. Okay, so now on the scope of the travel rule when dealing with unhosted wallets. So I said before that the travel rule requirements apply to unhosted wallets, but in a specific way. And this is because when transacting with unhosted wallets, there's no counterparty VASP with which the required travel rule information can be exchanged. So in these cases, what the FATF recommends is that the travel rule information that is usually required is collected from the VASP's own customer instead of being collected between VASPs. So to give a practical example, let's say I have an account at Binance and I want to send ETH to Alice's non-custodial wallet. In this case, Binance would ask me to provide the required information about Alice, and then would use this information to carry out the usual AML CTF obligations, such as screening Alice's name against sanction lists. And the same would apply if Alice would transfer ETH from her unhosted wallet to my Binance account. And in addition to this, the FATF also recommends that VASPs take a risk-based approach when interacting with unhosted wallets, and that they apply risk mitigation measures if necessary. And on this, I wanted to point out that the FATF already acknowledges the possibility of only allowing VASP to VASP transactions as exactly a solution to mitigate the risk of interacting with unhosted wallets. So here again is an example of a problem that the industry should try to solve and present a solution for. Otherwise, the regulatory response might not be the most desirable. And finally, on this topic, I wanted to point out that this specific component of the travel rule dealing with unhosted wallets is implemented across jurisdictions in very different ways. And if you could pass to the next slide. Yeah, and so when we looked at the different implementations of the travel rule across jurisdictions, we were able to identify essentially 4 different approaches to dealing with unhosted wallets, and I listed them here from less strict in yellow to strictest in red, and I'll leave you this slide for reference, but we'll not cover this in detail now for the sake of having time for a Q&A, but essentially the less strict jurisdictions only require VASPs to treat the transactions with unhosted wallets as higher risk and therefore enforce enhanced due diligence measures. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have Switzerland as an example of a jurisdiction that requires VASPs to identify the owner of the unhosted wallets, verify this identity and not only collect identity information, and also perform a proof of ownership of the wallet. We can go to the next. Okay. So still on the scope of application of the travel rule, we wanted to make a brief reference to intermediaries. And intermediaries are entities that sit somewhere in the chain of a virtual asset transfer and provide a service that facilitates this transfer. And we wanted to mention them first to highlight that the travel rule requirements are also applicable to these entities. And according to the FATF guidance, intermediaries are only required to pass the beneficiary and originator information along the chain of the transaction. So they are not required to verify any information, but they are nevertheless subject to record keeping obligations and to sanction compliance obligations as well. And this is a part of the implementation of the travel rule that is still a bit confusing to the industry, and there's a lot of work to be done there, both by the industry in finding a standard compliance flow for intermediaries, but also from the regulators to provide more guidance in this respect. We can go ahead. Okay. Okay, and so the last topic I wanted to cover regarding the scope of application of the travel rule is related to the timing for compliance. And to sum up this guidance, in this updated guidance, the FATF makes it very clear that the time for compliance is now. And they do that both when talking about allowing a staged approach to compliance and when talking about the sunrise period. And I'll tell you a bit about that here in this slide. So first, regarding the staged approach, this is exactly what we see in the industry, is that compliance with the travel rule does not happen at once. And most companies we work with are taking a staged approach so that they have sufficient time to implement all the new processes and systems that go into compliance with the travel rule. And in this guidance, the FATF acknowledges the need for this staged approach, but at the same time requires countries to enforce interim risk mitigation measures that enable that money laundering and terrorism financing risks are tackled now and not only when the full implementation is possible. Then on the sunrise period, for context, the sunrise period is a period during which travel rule requirements are not in force in all jurisdictions. And this is causing a lot of friction currently in the implementation of the travel rule because crypto is inherently international. And when VASPs are interacting with counterparties that don't have the same level of requirements, that makes it a bit tricky. But what the FATF says about that is that the sunrise issue should not preclude VASPs from already complying with the travel rule. And in this context, they suggest a number of measures that could be implemented to circumvent the sunrise issue while it exists. But most of them require substantial limitations to the VASP's transaction volume. So they say, for instance, that they could restrict transactions to only within their customer base or only first-party transactions, so transactions with external wallets, but that belong to their own customers. But this, of course, would have a huge business impact on the VASPs. And so on this, I would say that where coordination between policymakers can solve the problem, for instance, by achieving a simultaneous rollout of the travel rule across jurisdictions, that would be preferable to amplifying the business impacts of compliance for VASPs. Actually, I added here two graphics from the survey that I mentioned in the beginning. And one of them is the data to the question that we asked. So we asked the VASPs what were the most relevant hindrances to compliance, and the number one hindrance from the respondents so far is the sunrise period, exactly. And then we also saw that a few VASPs are reporting to having suspended all transactions until they figure out the travel rule. So we see how impactful it can be. So where regulators can help, that would be very welcome. Yeah, we can go ahead. Okay. Yes, I think exactly. This is the right slide. Okay, so now that we covered the scope of application of the travel rule, I'd like to jump to the actual requirements, and I would start with the counterparty VASP due diligence, because this is the first pain point and the first stage of complying with the travel rule. So, as I mentioned before, the first thing that VASPs should ask themselves is whether they are transacting with a counterparty VASP, as this will influence the rules that apply to the transaction. And this is still a big pain point for the industry, and this is acknowledged in the guidance. The FATF says that today it is not only it's not always possible to tell if a VASP is managing the wallet on the other side. But if there's actually a VASP on the other side and we are able to determine that, then the goal is that you only transact with counterparty VASPs that you trust. And to trust these VASPs, you first need to take the appropriate due diligence measures and look at several aspects of the VASP's business, such as the robustness of their data security framework, whether they are already complying with the travel rule, and whether the counterparty is under supervision of any relevant authority. And all of this needs to happen before transacting. So to mitigate the impact of this process on the VASP's businesses and on the speed of transactions as well, we as an industry need to work on ways to make due diligence scalable. And one example of these initiatives is the one being led by the GDF group, where they're trying to adapt the existing Wolfsburg questionnaire to VASP due diligence. So that would be a good building block for scaling due diligence in the industry. We can go to the next. Okay, so the second requirement that I wanted to cover is on data transmission requirements, as this is one big part of complying with the travel rule, is the actual exchange of originator and beneficiary information between VASPs. The specific information that VASPs need to share is listed here in the first line of this table. And what I wanted to highlight in this slide is that is the fact that the FATF now recognizes that when VASPs reasonably conclude that their counterparty does not handle PII securely, they can proceed with the blockchain transfer without sending the PII. And this is provided that first, of course, the money laundering risks are acceptable, and that the VASP adopts alternative procedures. And we very much welcome this novelty on the updated guidance, because here at Notabene we've been in talks with several regulators about the privacy preserving approach to compliance with the travel rule, and this approach would not require exchange of raw data, but rather of credentials that allow for the same risk mitigation measures to take place while substantially mitigating PII exposure. And regulators are generally very receptive to that idea, and this is one of the first explicit use cases for alternative means of compliance with the travel rule to tackle privacy risks that we've seen. So very excited about this change. Yes, we can go to the next slide. And here I just wanted to share a table that you can find in the guidance of the FATF, and maybe I'll skip the explanation here, but basically here they explain what data needs to be collected from whom and with which level of accuracy, and what VASPs actually need to do with this data, because that's also something that is a bit overlooked sometimes when talking about the travel rule, because there's a reason why VASPs are exchanging data. And that should be the end goal of the travel rule is that VASPs are able to use the data that they exchange for the purposes of screening their beneficiaries against sanction lists and appropriately tackle money laundering risks. So I think this table is a great summary of all of that you can consult afterwards, so that we can go to the Q&A soon. Okay. Okay, so this is the last topic I want to cover, and I'll be brief. Essentially, the goal of the sanction screening obligations imposed on VASPs is to prevent transaction with designated entities and allow VASPs to take freezing actions when such transactions take place. And for that to happen, VASPs are required to screen the names of their customers and also of the counterparties to any transactions against sanction lists. And on this topic, there's an inefficiency that I would like to point out and that I think we can solve as an industry, which is, if we go back to the previous slide, yeah, we see that if you look into this table, you will see that the ordering VASP, for instance, is required to screen the beneficiary information against sanction lists, although is not required to verify the accuracy of that information. So basically, the party that is burdened with screening obligations is not necessarily also burdened with verification of the underlying information that is used for the screening, which is probably not the most effective way of tackling screening or sanction compliance. But a change that we saw, or a novelty that we saw in this guidance that is also very positive in this direction, is that the FATF explicitly recognizes that the framework for relying on third parties for parts of your customer due diligence process could be used between VASPs. And what this means is that potentially a more effective approach would be to rely on the screening performed by the VASP that has the obligation to actually verify each party's data. So trusting the originating VASP with the screening of the originating person and the beneficiary VASP with the screening of the beneficiary person. This would likely be a more effective approach to tackling screening compliance. Yeah, and that's it from my side.
Great. Alice, did you, we just wanted to say thank you for joining here. There's a lot to understand with everything that happens here. There's a lot of unknowns still, but every time we get a new version of this, there are fewer and fewer unknowns, but also often case many more questions, right? So also, FATF, they only provide guidance and recommendations to national regulators. So everything has to be interpreted by national regulators. The travel rule, though, due to its inherent kind of international use, we definitely recommend people take a very international view of how to implement it, because you're not just dealing with your regulator, you're also dealing with every single of your counterparty exchanges regulators, which is why to be able to implement it, it makes sense to start with the FATF rules as a basis and then figure out where you need to add exceptions. But so on Q&A, there are a couple of questions left in here. So one is from Abu Dalzila. Do you predict a future where regulators can keep up with innovation in the financial industry, specifically crypto, that they would just give up and we would see an unregulated financial world pre-2000, like pre-2001? So I think a lot of the use of broad and expansive and technology agnostic, a lot of that language in these FATF recommendations, we're seeing similar things from FinCEN as well, is about them trying to create a broad umbrella that's not focused on the technology at a particular point in time. And that's always a risk when you try to create regulation around technology, where you aren't really moving forwards and moving the technology forward. But as an industry, we should continue to innovate, but it's also a good idea to just kind of look at these overall guidelines and recommendations to just figure out, would we maybe be covered in the future? And that shouldn't stop people from innovating for sure, but it's just something to keep an eye on. And the regulators have shown through this that they're trying to keep up, trying to give space for the industry to innovate, but also they have certain things that they need to continue to regulate. Marina Ponce asked, do entities that sell NFTs fall under VASP definition? I think there was a somewhat related question also in the chat around.
Basically, Pelle, Emily Halloran has a related question, but she also typed it in the Q&A.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so really the way to look at this is, if an NFT is considered a virtual asset, and we talked a little bit about this, if it's for investment purposes, then FATF considers it a virtual asset. If it's just as a collectible, it's not a virtual asset. And then, then it's difficult to say, when is it when are people buying this NFT just as a collectible, or only as an investment purpose, right? So if it is considered a virtual asset, and if you believe that people are likely buying NFTs on your platform for investment purposes, then you probably are considered a VASP. At least I would err on that. I definitely don't just trust us or me, get legal counsel on this, and maybe ask regulators for some, like local national regulators, for specifics around this. And then if you are a VASP, then to Emily's question, then you would have to, for example, implement the travel rule or some of these other aspects of it. And this is where the complexity of these things come in. It's not always completely easy. There's not always simple, clear answers for it. But the big question to answer around NFTs, are the NFTs on your platform, are people buying them from investment purposes or as collectible purposes, right? And I think that's the big distinction here. Don't know if there are any other questions. I don't see any other questions. We're also a little bit over, but really thanks to everyone for joining and for your questions. And please feel free to reach out to us, and we will continue to publish further articles on our blog and have further webinars going forward about this issue and the practicalities of actually implementing these rules. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a great day or evening or night or morning, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you.